Today I'm going to cover some really helpful tips if you want to make hyperpop beats. Hyperpop is a newer genre that isn't fully defined. I'd say there are still a bunch of different styles that fall under this category. In this video, I'm mainly looking at the more hip-hop derivative version of hyperpop and some of the key concepts that you need to know if you want to make it. First off, let's look at the structure of these beats and what makes them unique from other hip-hop genres. When you look at the drum pattern of this beat, something quickly becomes apparent. This is basically a trap drum pattern, and a very simple one at that. And by the way, if you guys enjoy my videos, think about subscribing. If you ever get tired of my videos, it's easy to unsubscribe. It really does help me out though. Now, what makes this different from a typical trap beat is that the BPM of this beat doesn't fall under the typical trap range. Most hyperpop beats are a bit faster than typical trap beats, yet they use the same drum framework. Many hyperpop beats have a BPM of 80 plus. Now you can imagine this is going to change your approach quite a bit with many of the other elements in your beat, especially with how complex the other musical layers are going to be, which we will cover shortly. Fundamentally with hyperpop, there's just going to be a lot going on in a shorter amount of space. It's like a condensed trap beat to some degree. So when it comes to creating complex drum patterns where you have insane stuttering hi-hats and over-the-top 808 slides, you might want to be a bit conservative, otherwise you might overwhelm the listener. And this is especially true because of how complex the musical layers are in these beats, which leads me to my second tip. Let's take a look at what I've created here. Typically with hyperpop beats, you have a very fast moving melody. That's one of the distinct components of these types of beats. We have a lot of notes playing in a short amount of time. So let's think about where we are so far. We have a trap drum pattern that is typically meant to be played at a slower BPM, but this has been condensed. As well, we have a melodically complex pattern that's going to be the main component that drives this beat. So as you can see, we just have a lot going on with just a few layers. And this is why it's typically going to be a good idea to limit the amount of layers that you have in your hyperpop beat. You have a lot going on in a shorter amount of time, so be very selective with what you choose when producing hyperpop. Now, in order to build this melody, I did something sneaky that you can use when you're making hyperpop beats, or any beats really. I basically just used an ARP. Now, if you are unfamiliar with what ARPs are, I'm going to quickly show some of the basics as well as some advanced tips that you can use. Typically in many of the plugins that you have, you will find a section in the presets that says ARPs or arpeggios, something along those lines. Here I'm using Expand, which is a plugin that I always recommend to newer producers. It's inexpensive and it has a great variety of quality sounds that you can usually pick up for $15 or so. But here you can see we have these categories, multi-track arpeggios and simple arpeggios. Let's go ahead and select one of these. Now what these sounds do is that they'll continuously play one note using one rhythm as long as you have one note held down. But when you layer more than one note in, you guys can hear what's going to happen. It will go back and forth between these two notes and play the same rhythm. And obviously the more notes you layer in, the more notes it will jump in between. But different ARPs can play different rhythms and different notes. For example, if you go back into your plugin, there will likely be an ARP section where you can control different parameters. So here, if I were to change this mode, and I also change the rate, for example, we get something different here, and this is exactly what we can use in order to build out complex hyperpop melodies. If you just load up an ARP and you copy and paste your chords over into your ARP, you can easily create a melody that follows and fits with what you've already built. And if you feel like this is cheating, by the way, you feel guilty about doing stuff like this, I highly recommend watching this video right above my head, because this is a great technique that you should be using if you want to produce. Now here are some more advanced ideas that you need to know if you want to use this method. What if I took these notes and I shifted them around? Let's take a look at these lower notes here and see what happens if I shift them around slightly. We've changed what the ARP plays, and this can be a great way for you to play around with the melody that your ARP comes up with. What's basically happening when you use ARPs is that the plugin uses the MIDI and decides what pattern to play and when to play based on the MIDI notes that are currently being triggered. But if we start to play with when each MIDI note's currently playing, we can get some really unique patterns by just making these slight adjustments here. You can even see this with my pattern here. If I just copy and pasted my chords into my ARP, this is how it would have sounded. But take a look at what I did here instead. I made some small nudges here and there, I removed certain notes from playing at certain times, I added extra notes in at times as well, and this is how I got this melody, which I ended up liking a lot better. Now this does take some experimenting, and I will fully admit this can be a pain to control at times, so if you want to be more hands-on with your approach, here's another trick that you can use. If you like what your ARP comes up with, but you just want to change a few notes here and there, you can do this by doing the following. Step 1, go into your plugin and remove all of the effects so you get a very dry signal. And obviously remove any plugins that you may have added yourself. Next up, go into your mixer and right-click the channel and select Open Audio Logger. For those that have seen my video and everything that you need to know when you're using the mixer, you know what I'm doing here. So now we're going to record this pattern out. Once it's recorded, right-click, go into Tools, and select Convert to Score and Dump to Piano Roll. And there we go. At this point, we have all of our MIDI notes, and we can just adjust them and customize our melody as we see fit. And the reason why I advise turning off all of your effects is because it will give you more accurate data. FL Studio will just have a harder time recognizing notes if there's a crazy amount of reverb and delay and whatnot. So this can be a method that you can use if you're stuck when you're creating a melody. Play around with some ARP presets, and if you hear one that you like, you can just use it as a starting point. Adjust and customize whatever it comes up with using this method. And finally, the last tip that I want to cover has to do with sound selection. These types of beats have a very synthy feel to them, obviously, but I would say that not all synths will work equally well for these types of beats. Going back to my prior point about busyness and how we only have room for a handful of sounds in our beats here, our beat would end up sounding a lot more busy and possibly cluttered if we chose the wrong type of synth. I would recommend leaning towards less aggressive, more transparent shapes. So sounds that are built using triangle waves or maybe even sine waves if you distort them well. To me, these sounds feel really smooth and they really capture the aesthetic of these types of beats. And they also fit in very well. You can hear how this beat would sound if we chose something a little bit different, like a saw wave, for example. This beat is a lot more intrusive and the beat becomes a bit overbearing, whereas if we just go back to our triangle here, it's just a bit more smooth and it feels like it fits into this genre of beat, which is already so busy and full. So if you have a hard time picking sounds that actually fit, I'd recommend leaning towards triangles primarily, maybe even sines. And that's it, guys. Those are my tips for making hyperpop beats. If you've enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. If you're interested in more advanced beatmaking tutorials, head over to betterbeatmaker.com. That's where my full course is. My free drum kit's available in the description box below, as well as a link to the Discord if you want to join my producer community. Otherwise, I will see you guys later.